collective action problem here. Okay. So I think these problems are pervasive. George, how have people tried to solve these problems through private means?
Judging by the title of the paper,
Yeah.
my answer would have been just general goodwill.
Yeah, so like what would be an example of that in practice?
So if Al Gore
Yep.
to want to lower global warming would spend a good bit of money seeking a way to like get more people to follow him and support that project.
Yeah, so like you might go around and like have ethical consumption campaigns or something like that, right? They've sort of tried to do that for global warming, like buy green stuff. And you guys have seen about how effective that's been. I think the people in New York saw how effective that was. So I'll try to argue. Okay, so people often do public-spirited things like giving to charity, voting, which is probably not worth your time given that you have like no chance of affecting the outcome. Volunteering for the military. These are not classic self-interested things, and culture, such as cultures of heroism, cultures of public spiritedness and voting, can motivate people to do this through various means. People want to do things that are prestigious, that look good to other people, maybe to future mates. They want to, it just makes them feel good about themselves, right, that they do these things. They may want to show other people what sort of a person they are, the sort of person who would vote, the sort of person who would fight in a war for their country, right? Maybe because that makes them look good in their career, maybe because it makes them look good to people that they might potentially marry, right? So there's no question that these things help, but they require a long and slow development of cultures around these things. So like, ancient Sparta, I don't think had any public goods problem in terms of getting people to like fight in the military, but it required sort of like a whole organization of their culture to get people to do that, right? Even though they didn't necessarily coerce people. And the problem is, in the fast-moving world we have today, there's all sorts of public goods problems that are constantly coming up. Developing a whole culture around, giving up your land and for the good of the state to build a research facility would take a long, long time, much longer than it would, we would be willing to wait before we had to build that facility. Andy, do you have a question?
I was just kind of curious
Yeah.
if those three effects were exclusive to each other.
Go.
As in, so like signaling is sort of encapsulated in prestige, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of what prestige is other than just signaling.
Right.
I think I'm a little hesitant to just say all prestige can just be reduced to signaling. Because I think that people get value out of prestige that doesn't really serve any particular instrumental purpose. Like, I think a lot of people like being famous and prestigious, even if they can't get anything with that. So I don't think it's all captured by signaling, but some of it is, for sure. I know someone who said that the only reason that Bill Gates had created the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was in order to get laid. And I don't think that is likely to be the case, but it's possible. If goods are, if private goods or public goods or public bads are local and it's easy to move, then people can move to the place where the goods are provided at the best level. And this is called taboo competition. In this, local areas will compete in the provision of these goods in order to attract people. And this is important for many local public services such as street cleaning, schools, police, fire, etc. But this crucially depends on mobility, right? People must be able to cheaply move to the best areas. And the value of the good must be relatively independent of the area in which they consume this good. But in some sense, that makes things effectively excludable, right? Because you can always keep someone out of a community or charge them to come into that community, right? it also makes things a bit rival because the community will start to fill up. You can't have too many people living there, right? So in some sense, this stuff is not really public goods. It is a little bit of the character of public goods, but it only works for this stuff that really has this local character to it, and that people, can freely move to different areas, so they're not just stuck consuming the thing or not. Okay. So the most famous solution to the public goods problem was proposed by two Swedish guys, Erik Lindahl and Knut Wicksell. And to consider the simplest case of their solution, let's imagine that we have a project which is just yes or no. We're going to either build something or not build it, right? And imagine that each citizen gets a value VI from the project being undertaken, and the total cost of creating the project is capital C. And the idea of Lindahl and Wicksell was that everyone would have a share of this project, which would correspond to how much of the total value was received by them. And then what we do is we ask everyone to pay a share of the cost, which corresponds to the share of the total value that they receive as an individual, right? Now, it's efficient to create the project if the total value created is greater than the total cost, right? And notice that if everyone pays their their Lindahl share, then everyone will either agree or not agree on the project, right? So if the project is efficient, then V is greater than C, which is the same as little vi being greater than their share of the cost, right? So a natural mechanism is to say, look, let's have everyone have to pay their Lindahl share. If everyone agrees to build the project, let's build it and you'll pay your share. If anyone disagrees, let's not build the project, right? And that's going to lead the project to succeed for everyone to agree if and only if the project is efficient, right? Because everyone is either going to agree or everyone's going to disagree, right? And the reason that this is credible is that everyone's pivotal, right? Everyone is going to say yes because they know that if they say no, they veto the whole project, right? And so they're not going to claim that it's not worth as much to them because then the whole project doesn't occur, right? It's because everyone has the risk that the project's not going to take place that they have an incentive to tell the truth, right? So this is called Lindahl pricing or equilibrium and Wickelsian unanimity. Now the question is, would this really work in practice? And I think no. And Clémence, why do you think that in practice this wouldn't really work?
First, to establish the share, you have to know the value of everybody.
Yeah, that's key. And why would that cause a problem?
Because, if you don't establish a right share for your own interest, it's not going to be good to participate in the product because the value is going to be lower than the value of it.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, the first problem is that it might not really be credible. If you're saying, look, this system's only going to work if you say, seriously, everybody has to consent. If anyone says no, we're not going to do it. But that's not really credible. Imagine one person says no. You would probably be like, okay, you don't have to pay as much.
Yeah.
Let's just go to everybody else and let's see if they're willing to pay. Then everyone else is going to say, oh shit, that guy got that great deal by saying that he wasn't willing to pay. And that undermines the whole system, right? But even if this was credible, right, more importantly, the problem is we don't know everybody's values, as Clémence very intelligently said, right? So everyone has to agree in order for the project to succeed. But people are only going to agree if their value is greater than their share of the cost. And imagine that their value, that their share was only approximately their share of the value, right? Then the problem is that if there's a lot of people, even a little bit of mistake, there's going to be almost certainly somebody whose value is less than their share of the cost if you don't estimate it perfectly, right? And I think that's why it's hard to imagine using this system, right? almost any time you require everyone to agree, there's going to be one person who just for like some reason is bloody-minded and like won't allow this thing to go through, right? And you can sort of study this problem by crunching some numbers. So imagine that everyone has a value. And imagine that we don't know differences between people. So we just think everyone's share is 1 over n, right? So the probability that someone refuses to accept the offer is going to be the probability that their value is less than their share of the cost over n. That probability is the cumulative distribution function f of c over n, right? And so that means that the probability that any individual is going to agree to the offer is 1 minus f of c over n, right? So the probability that everybody consents is 1 minus f of c over n to the n, right? Now imagine that by some miracle, we were able to get it down to the point where that there was only a 1 in 1,000 chance that someone said no, right? That seems pretty unlikely, right? That we could make this so attractive and estimate things so well that we would get it down to 1 in 1,000 chance, right? But in that case, if there were 1,000 people, still there was only a 35% chance that the thing works out. And if you got to the size of a small town, then there would be less than 1 in 20,000 chance that it works out, right? Okay. So this is how it goes. Imagine there's a 1 in 1,000 chance. As the number of people increases, the probability goes to 0 very, very quickly, right? And this is not just true of this simple scheme where we make the where we say, look, we're going to do it if and only if everyone agrees. The problem that you face is if you do use the system where we say, look, we do it if and only if everyone agrees, well, then you run into the problem of having one stubborn person. On the other hand, if you use a system that says, OK, contribute as much as you're willing to, then everyone contributes way too little. But every system is going to have to do one thing or the other of that, right? If you start saying, oh, well, we're going to try to get 1/2 of the people to agree, and only they will have to pay, right? Well, then no one's going to be one of those half of the people that's going to have to pay, and so they're all going to underestimate. Any way you try to do it, you run into one of these two problems in one form or the other, right? So you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. This is the basis of a theorem, just like the versions of Cournot's theorem we were talking about before, which is called the May-Lath-Postlethwaite theorem. It says if everyone must consent to their funding of a project and no external funds are available, the probability that the project is undertaken goes to 0 as the number of people gets large, right? So what this says is that no private, that is voluntary and self-financing system can provide public goods in a large population, right? Okay. So we always run into this collective action problem. And that means that public projects, either public goods or public bads, are going to require some coercion, right? And there are basically, based on this theorem, 2 different ways in which coercion can operate. And Andy, what are those? What are the 2 forms of coercion we could use to try to break this last result?
So one form is that we can force people to agree as sort of a community.
Yep.
So we would tie their interests together.
Yep.
And the other form is we can try to keep them funds external.
Yeah, exactly. So we said no voluntary and self-financing thing can work. We can, and to solve that, we can either force people to consent, right? Or we can raise external funds. But the question is, where does that money come from? Maybe you could get it from charity or something like that, but that's not going to be enough, as we said. Or you could use taxes, right?